In the autumn of 1847, Whitfield County, Georgia, stood as testimony to what men could build upon the backs of those they refused to see as human. The Blackwood Estate stretched across 650 acres of prime tobacco land along the Etowah River, where the soil ran so rich it could turn seeds into gold. But wealth has a way of corrupting the soul, and on this particular plantation, cruelty had evolved into something approaching an art form. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is not a story about heroes or villains in the way you might expect. This is a story about what happens when a human being is pushed so far beyond the boundaries of endurance that something fundamental breaks inside them. It's about the mathematics of revenge, calculated across years of silent observation and patient waiting. It's about 8 foxhounds that served as instruments of terror for nearly 2 decades, until one October night when their keeper decided to change their diet in a way that would haunt Whitfield County for generations. What transpired at the Blackwood Estate during those final weeks of autumn 1847 would never be fully documented in official records. The truth was too disturbing, too revealing of the rot at the heart of the institution that built the South's prosperity. But the story survived, whispered among those who understood that sometimes justice wears a face that polite society refuses to acknowledge. The Blackwood Estate had been carved from Georgia wilderness 3 generations before our story begins, built by men who understood that tobacco required backbreaking labor and that enslaved people provided the cheapest possible workforce. By 1847, William Blackwood had inherited not just land and wealth, but a philosophy of control that his grandfather had perfected and his father had refined into something approaching a science. The estate's 8 foxhounds lived in kennels constructed from cypress wood behind the main tobacco barn, far enough from the plantation house that the family wouldn't be disturbed by their baying, but close enough that their presence served as a constant reminder to the enslaved population. These weren't pets or simple hunting dogs. They were weapons of psychological warfare, trained from birth to track human scent through the dense Georgia pine forests that surrounded the property on 3 sides. William Blackwood stood 6 feet tall with shoulders like an oak beam and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. At 48 years old, he ran his plantation with the efficiency of a military operation and the ruthlessness of a man who'd never once questioned his God-given right to own other human beings. He had 3 children who survived to adulthood, though only 2 still lived on the estate by the time our story unfolds. Gregory Blackwood, the eldest son at 28, had grown into a carbon copy of his father's worst qualities without any of the old man's business acumen or strategic thinking. Where William was calculatingly cruel, Gregory was impulsively vicious. Where his father saw enslaved people as valuable property to be maintained, Gregory saw them as objects upon which he could exercise his darker impulses without consequence. The tobacco fields bore witness to his temper on a weekly basis, and more than one enslaved person carried scars from encounters with Gregory's walking stick, which he wielded with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed the sound it made against human flesh. Marcus Pemberton served as overseer, a position he'd held for 6 years by 1847. Unlike some overseers who drifted from plantation to plantation, Pemberton had found in the Blackwood Estate a place where his particular talents were appreciated and well compensated. He was a methodical man who believed that discipline should be public, severe, and frequent enough to prevent the need for more extreme measures. He carried a braided leather whip with bone fragments woven into the final 6 inches, a tool he designed himself and took considerable pride in maintaining. The 42 enslaved people who worked the Blackwood Estate lived in a collection of rough cabins arranged in 2 rows facing each other, creating a kind of street that ran perpendicular to the main house. The cabins were constructed from pine logs chinked with mud and moss, each housing between 4 and 8 people depending on family size. There were no floors, just packed earth that turned to mud during Georgia's frequent rains. Windows were merely openings covered with wooden shutters that did little to keep out the cold during winter months. Life on a tobacco plantation followed rhythms different from cotton or rice. The work was equally brutal but required different skills and created different opportunities for those who paid attention. Tobacco cultivation demanded careful attention throughout the growing season. Seeds started in beds required transplanting to fields, constant weeding, topping to prevent flowering, suckering to redirect growth into leaves, worming to protect the crop, and finally the delicate process of harvesting and curing that could make or break an entire year's profit. The harvest season of autumn brought the most intense labor. Leaves had to be picked at exactly the right moment of ripeness, handled carefully to prevent bruising, and hung in the curing barns where temperature and humidity required constant monitoring. A mistake during curing could transform valuable tobacco into worthless compost, which meant that William Blackwood watched the harvest with obsessive attention and tolerated no errors from his workforce. Into this world, Thomas had been born in the spring of 1829, delivered in one of those rough pine cabins by a midwife who attended to births between her regular work in the fields. His mother Ruth had worked tobacco all her life, first on a plantation in North Carolina before being sold south to Georgia when she was 16. She'd survived 25 years of bondage through a combination of strategic silence and an ability to make herself invisible when danger approached. Thomas's father had been sold away when Thomas was 3 years old, a transaction conducted so casually that the boy barely remembered the man's face. What he did remember was his mother's silence afterward, the way she'd stopped singing the work song she used to hum while cooking their evening meals. That silence taught Thomas his first lesson about survival under bondage. Some losses were too deep for tears, too profound for words. You simply carried them inside like stones in your belly and kept moving. Thomas had a younger brother named Daniel, born 2 years after him. The boys were inseparable through early childhood, sharing everything from the cornmeal mush that constituted breakfast to the thin blanket they slept under during winter nights. Daniel was the talker of the two, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries in small ways that made Ruth nervous. Thomas was the watcher, the one who noticed patterns and remembered details. When Thomas turned 12, William Blackwood made a decision that would shape the rest of the boy's life. The estate's previous kennel keeper, an older enslaved man named Jacob, had died suddenly from what the plantation's doctor vaguely described as heart failure. The foxhounds needed someone who could handle them, feed them, maintain the kennels, and most importantly, prepare them for the hunts that served as both sport and terror depending on what was being tracked. William had observed Thomas around the plantation and noticed something that others missed. The boy moved quietly, spoke rarely, and seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of animal behavior. Dogs that snarled at other enslaved people would tolerate Thomas's presence. Horses that shied from rough handling would calm when the boy approached. It was a gift that William Blackwood recognized as useful, never considering that such a gift required intelligence and observation skills that might one day be turned to other purposes. Thomas's assignment to the kennels removed him from field labor and placed him in a peculiar position within the plantation hierarchy. He wasn't house staff, who occupied the highest rung among enslaved people and often adopted airs that separated them from field workers. But he also wasn't subjected to the grinding daily labor of tobacco cultivation that wore down bodies and spirits with relentless efficiency. He existed in a space between, with mobility that other enslaved people didn't possess and access to areas of the. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Plantation that were normally restricted. The foxhounds themselves were magnificent animals from a purely physical standpoint. Bred for stamina and sending ability, they stood about 2 feet tall at the shoulder with lean muscular frames built for running. Their coats were predominantly white with black and tan patches, and their eyes held an intensity that came from generations of selective breeding for hunting drive. William Blackwood had paid premium prices for breeding stock from Virginia kennels known for producing dogs with exceptional tracking ability. Training foxhounds for hunting was a complex process that Thomas learned through observation and trial. The dogs needed to learn to follow a specific scent trail while ignoring distractions, to bay loudly when they'd treed or cornered their quarry, and to work as a pack rather than as individuals. Traditionally, foxhounds chased foxes, which is how they got their name. But on the Blackwood Estate, these dogs had been trained for a different kind of quarry entirely. When an enslaved person attempted to escape, which happened several times a year despite the near certainty of capture and brutal punishment, William Blackwood would have Thomas bring out the hounds. The process was ritualized and designed for maximum psychological impact. An article of the escapees' clothing would be retrieved from their cabin and presented to the dogs, who would work themselves into a frenzy as they picked up the scent. Then they'd be released with Thomas and often Gregory Blackwood following on horseback while the pack bayed through the forest. What happened when the dogs caught up to an escapee varied depending on the circumstances and the Blackwoods' mood. Sometimes the person would be treed, surrounded by baying hounds until the men arrived to drag them down and bind them for transport back to the plantation. Sometimes the dogs would attack, tearing at clothes and flesh until called off. Thomas had witnessed both scenarios more times than he could count, forced to observe as part of his duties managing the pack. These experiences accumulated inside Thomas like sediment at the bottom of a river. Each hunt, each recapture, each scream echoing through the Georgia pines added another layer to a growing mass of hatred and rage that he learned to bury so deeply that even his own mother couldn't see it. He developed a face that showed nothing, eyes that reflected only obedience, and a posture that suggested complete acceptance of his role. It was a performance so convincing that William Blackwood trusted him completely. The Blackwood family never suspected that Thomas's mind was cataloging everything. He knew which boards in the main house creaked, which windows didn't latch properly, where supplies were stored, and how the family's routines shifted with the seasons. He knew that William Blackwood took a glass of whiskey every night before bed, that Gregory often rode into Dalton on Friday evenings and returned drunk well after midnight, and that Marcus Pemberton made his rounds of the slave quarters at irregular intervals designed to prevent predictability. Thomas fed the hounds twice daily, once at dawn and again at dusk. The feeding process required preparation that most people never witnessed. He'd mix cornmeal with meat scraps from the main house kitchen, add water to create a thick mush, and distribute it among 8 feeding troughs in the kennel yard. The dogs ate voraciously, their breeding and training creating appetites that required careful management. Underfed dogs became sluggish and useless for hunting. Overfed dogs became lazy and lost their edge. Thomas had learned to calibrate their portions with precision, maintaining them in a state of controlled hunger that made them eager and aggressive when released for a hunt. The kennels themselves required daily maintenance that was both physically demanding and monotonous. Waste had to be shoveled out and hauled to a pit downwind of all plantation buildings. Fresh straw had to be spread in the sleeping areas. Water troughs needed filling from the well near the tobacco barn. Equipment like leads, collars, and muzzles required inspection and repair. It was work that kept Thomas busy but also gave him time alone with his thoughts in a way that field labor never allowed. During his 14th year, something happened that would forever alter the trajectory of Thomas's existence. His brother Daniel, now 12 years old, had been caught talking back to Marcus Pemberton during a particularly hot afternoon in the tobacco fields. The infraction was minor, nothing more than a frustrated mutter under his breath when the overseer criticized the pace of his work. But Pemberton had heard it, and on the Blackwood Estate, any sign of disrespect from an enslaved person required immediate and severe correction. The punishment was scheduled for the following morning, a deliberate delay designed to let fear ferment overnight throughout the slave quarters. Everyone knew what was coming. Daniel would be tied to the whipping post that stood in the center of the open area between the cabin rows, and Pemberton would administer 20 lashes with his specially designed whip. 20 lashes could permanently scar a grown man. On a 12-year-old boy, it could be fatal. Ruth spent that night on her knees, not praying because she'd long ago stopped believing any God listened to the prayers of enslaved people, but simply kneeling in a kind of helpless vigil. Thomas sat beside her in silence, watching his brothers sleep fitfully on their shared pallet. He understood with perfect clarity that this moment represented a threshold. Daniel would either survive this punishment and be broken by it, learning to swallow his pride and anger the way their mother had, or he would die from it, or he would survive and become something dangerous that the Blackwoods would eventually need to eliminate. The whipping began at dawn. All enslaved people were required to witness punishments, a practice William Blackwood believed essential for maintaining discipline. They formed a rough semicircle around the post where Daniel had been stripped to the waist and bound with his arms above his head. The boy's back looked impossibly thin and vulnerable in the early morning light, ribs visible beneath skin that had never known gentleness. Thomas stood between his mother and an older field worker named Isaac. He forced himself to watch every moment, to memorize every detail. He observed how Marcus Pemberton rolled his shoulders before each strike, how he paused between lashes to examine the damage, how Gregory Blackwood watched with obvious pleasure from the porch of the main house. He noted which enslaved people looked away and which forced themselves to witness. He recorded the exact sound the whip made as it tore through flesh, a wet snapping noise that would echo in his memory forever. Daniel screamed through the first 10 lashes, sounds that weren't quite human, torn from some primal place where language dissolved into pure agony. After the 15th lash, he stopped screaming and simply hung from the post, semi-conscious, blood running down his back in rivulets that dripped onto the packed earth below. Pemberton delivered the final 5 lashes with methodical precision, ensuring they crossed previous wounds in a pattern that would maximize scarring. When it was over, Daniel was cut down and carried to the cabin he shared with Thomas and Ruth. The plantation's doctor, such as he was, came to examine the boy and pronounced that he would likely survive if infection didn't set in. He left a small tin of salve that Ruth was to apply twice daily and instructions to keep the wounds clean. Then he departed, already dismissing the incident as routine. Ruth tended to Daniel with the kind of fierce concentration that came from having no other outlet for her rage and grief. She cleaned the wounds with water she'd boiled and carefully strained through cloth. She applied the salve with touches so gentle they barely made contact. She fashioned a kind of tent from their blanket so that nothing would touch Daniel's destroyed back while he slept. And through it all, she maintained the same terrible silence she'd carried since Thomas's father had been sold away. Thomas helped however he could, but mostly he simply observed. He watched his mother's hands move with practiced efficiency despite their trembling. He noted how Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out for water, sometimes making sounds that had no meaning. He memorized the patterns the wounds made across his brother's back, reading them like text that spelled out the fundamental truth of their existence. Daniel survived, but the boy who recovered was different from the one who'd been tied to that post. Something had calcified inside him, hardening into a bitter resolve that Thomas recognized as dangerous. Daniel no longer tried to hide his hatred. It showed in his eyes when he looked at any white person, burned in the set of his jaw, radiated from his posture even when he was supposedly showing deference. He'd stopped caring about the consequences of his anger, which meant he'd become a threat to his own survival. 6 months later, William Blackwood made the decision to sell Daniel. The official explanation was that the boy had reached an age where his value was optimal for sale, and that a trader passing through had made an offer too good to refuse. But everyone in the slave quarters understood the real reason. Daniel had become unpredictable, and unpredictable enslaved people were dangerous to keep. Better to trade them for reliable currency than risk whatever explosion might be building inside them. The sale happened quickly, conducted in the front yard of the main house on a Tuesday morning. A trader named Hutchins arrived with a wagon already partially loaded with human cargo bound for the auction blocks in Savannah. He examined Daniel with the detached professionalism of a man who'd evaluated thousands of enslaved people, checking his teeth, making him walk back and forth, palpating his muscles to assess his fitness for hard labor. Thomas and Ruth were allowed to say goodbye, a small mercy that William Blackwood granted because he considered himself a reasonable man who understood that enslaved people had primitive family attachments that could be accommodated when it didn't interfere with business. The farewell lasted perhaps 5 minutes, conducted under the watchful eyes of Marcus Pemberton to ensure no plans for escape or rebellion were whispered between family members. Daniel embraced his mother with an intensity that suggested he understood they'd never see each other again. Then he turned to Thomas and gripped his older brother's shoulders with hands that had become surprisingly strong despite his youth. He spoke only 4 words, delivered in a whisper that Pemberton couldn't hear from where he stood. "Remember me, brother." Then he was loaded into the wagon, chained alongside 3 other enslaved people, and driven away down the long oak line drive that led from the Blackwood Estate to the main road. Ruth's decline began immediately. She continued working in the tobacco fields because stopping would mean punishment, but she moved through the days like someone not fully present in her own body. She ate only when others forced food on her. She stopped maintaining their cabin with the meticulous care she'd always demonstrated. Most tellingly, she stopped speaking except when absolutely necessary, answering questions with single words or simply nodding or shaking her head. Thomas watched his mother fade with a growing sense of helplessness that gradually transformed into something colder and more purposeful. He understood that grief this profound would not resolve itself, that Ruth had decided on some unconscious level to simply stop participating in a life that had taken everything she valued. He also understood that there was nothing he could do to reverse this decision. All he could do was bear witness and remember. Ruth died on a January morning in 1843, found by Thomas when he returned from his dawn feeding of the foxhounds. She had passed during the night, lying on her side on the pallet she'd shared with her sons, her body curled into a shape that suggested she'd been trying to make herself as small as possible. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, and her face held an expression that might have been peace if you were generous in your interpretation. The plantation's doctor came again, examined Ruth's body with cursory attention, and declared that her heart had simply stopped. No investigation was conducted because enslaved people died with some regularity and their deaths rarely warranted detailed inquiry unless foul play was suspected. Ruth was buried that same afternoon in the section of plantation land designated for the enslaved dead, a scrubby area beyond the tobacco fields where wooden markers gradually weathered into illegibility. Thomas stood at his mother's grave long after the brief ceremony ended and the other mourners returned to their cabins. He stood until the sun set and Marcus Pemberton came to tell him he needed to return to his duties. Even then, he moved slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving that spot meant abandoning the last physical connection to his family. Something fundamental shifted inside Thomas after Ruth's death. The performance he'd maintained since childhood, the mask of obedient acceptance, became somehow even more convincing while simultaneously becoming entirely hollow. He smiled when expected to smile, bowed his head in appropriate deference, executed his duties with mechanical efficiency. But behind the facade, he'd become something else entirely. A calculator. A strategist. A man with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing restraining him from patience. He began observing the Blackwood family with new intensity, studying them the way a naturalist might study specimens. He noted William's habits and schedules, cataloging the older man's predictable routines and the few variations that broke the pattern. He watched Gregory's volatility, learning to anticipate the son's moods based on subtle cues like the set of his shoulders or the tightness around his eyes. He observed how the two men interacted, noting the dynamics of power and resentment that occasionally surfaced in their conversations. Thomas paid particular attention to their movements around the plantation. He memorized which paths they took when riding out to inspect the tobacco fields. He noted the times they typically departed for business in Dalton and when they returned. He observed which enslaved people they trusted and which they viewed with suspicion. He studied the foxhounds' reactions to different family members, understanding that William commanded the dogs' respect while Gregory merely intimidated them. The kennels became Thomas's laboratory and fortress. Here, away from constant observation, he could think and plan without interruption. The dogs provided cover for his contemplation, their presence explaining why he spent so much time in this isolated part of the plantation. He talked to them sometimes, not because he expected them to understand but because the act of verbalizing thoughts helped him organize them into coherent strategies. He also began experimenting with the dogs' training in subtle ways that no one else would notice. He taught them to respond to hand signals in addition to verbal commands, a modification he explained to William as useful for hunting situations where silence was necessary. He conditioned them to remain calm around him even when they were in hunting mode, establishing a bond that went beyond mere keeper and animals. He learned to read their body language with such precision that he could predict their reactions before they occurred. Thomas also expanded his knowledge of the plantation's geography beyond the immediate estate grounds. He volunteered for tasks that required him to travel to neighboring properties to borrow equipment or deliver messages. He memorized roads and trails, noting which routes offered cover and which were exposed. He learned the locations of streams and rivers, understanding that water could confuse even the best tracking dogs. He identified areas of dense forest where visibility dropped to mere feet and where someone could disappear if they knew the terrain. By his 16th year, Thomas had become indispensable to the Blackwood Estate's operations. No one else could manage the foxhounds with his skill. No one else could prepare them for hunts with his efficiency. When enslaved people attempted escape, which still happened occasionally despite the brutal certainty of recapture, William Blackwood relied entirely on Thomas to track them down. This trust, paradoxically built on Thomas's effectiveness as an instrument of oppression, gave him a kind of freedom that other enslaved people could only dream of. He used this freedom carefully, never pushing boundaries far enough to generate suspicion but constantly testing the limits of his mobility. He'd occasionally mention to William that one of the dogs needed exercise and then spend hours ranging through the forests that bordered the plantation. He'd suggest that he needed to check on a section of fence line around the kennel yards and use that as cover to explore areas he wasn't normally supposed to access. Each of these small expansions of territory added to his growing mental map of the landscape. Isaac, the field worker who had stood beside Thomas during Daniel's whipping, gradually became something approaching a confidant. Isaac was 7 years older than Thomas, built like an oak tree with hands that could snap tobacco stalks like twigs. He'd been purchased by William Blackwood from a plantation in South Carolina 3 years earlier, separated from his wife and 2 children in a transaction that had left him with a kind of quiet fury that he kept carefully hidden beneath a facade of plodding obedience. The 2 men began having careful conversations during those rare moments when their work brought them into proximity without oversight. They never discussed anything explicitly dangerous, never mentioned plans or possibilities. Instead, they talked around subjects, using the kind of coded language that enslaved people had perfected over generations of survival. They'd discuss the weather and make observations about how certain atmospheric conditions affected the dog's tracking abilities. They'd talk about the tobacco harvest and mention which times of year the plantation's routines became most predictable. Thomas learned that Isaac possessed skills that complemented his own knowledge. The older man knew how to move through forests without leaving obvious trails. He understood how to read the night sky for navigation. He'd worked briefly on a rice plantation in the Low Country and knew about tidal patterns and waterways. Most importantly, he'd maintained contact with an informal network of enslaved people on neighboring plantations, a web of connections that passed information through subtle signals and brief encounters during market days in Dalton. As Thomas approached his 18th year, he'd refined his understanding of the Blackwood Estate's vulnerabilities. He knew that William and Gregory typically traveled to Savannah twice a year to conduct business with tobacco brokers, trips that required them to be away for 4 to 6 days. He knew that Marcus Pemberton's oversight became less rigorous during these absences, the overseer taking advantage of his employer's absence to spend more time drinking in his cabin. He knew which enslaved people could be trusted and which might betray plans if they thought cooperation would earn them favor. He also understood something more fundamental about the system that enslaved him. The Blackwoods' power rested not just on violence but on their ability to make that violence seem inevitable and inescapable. The foxhounds represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy, 8 animals that embodied the impossibility of freedom. Every successful hunt reinforced the message that escape was futile, that the forest itself had been turned against those who dared to run. Thomas began to conceive of a plan that would invert this dynamic entirely. He couldn't simply run, because the dogs would track him down as they'd tracked down dozens before him. He couldn't simply kill the dogs, because their deaths would be immediately noticed and he'd be the obvious suspect. What he needed was something more sophisticated, a strategy that would use the plantation's own instruments of control against those who wielded them. The plan took shape slowly, refined over months of careful consideration. It required patience, precise timing, and a willingness to do things that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. But Thomas had learned through bitter experience that survival sometimes demanded choices that destroyed part of your humanity. He'd watched his brother sold away and his mother die of grief. He participated in the recapture of people whose only crime was wanting to be free. He'd fed and maintained the very dogs that made escape impossible for everyone on the plantation. In October of 1847, opportunity and preparation finally converged. William and Gregory announced they would be traveling to Savannah to finalize contracts with new tobacco brokers, a trip that would take them away from the plantation for at least 5 days. the harvest had been completed successfully, which meant the plantation's routines would be relaxed during their absence. The autumn weather had turned cool but not yet cold, creating conditions that would be important for what Thomas had planned. He approached Isaac 3 weeks before the scheduled departure, during a brief encounter near the tobacco barn while both men were supposedly occupied with their respective tasks. Thomas spoke quietly, barely moving his lips, watching the periphery to ensure no one was within earshot. He told Isaac that something was going to happen while the Blackwoods were away, something that would require absolute secrecy and nerves steady enough to maintain normal behavior under intense pressure afterward. He asked if Isaac was willing to participate without knowing the specific details until the moment of action. Isaac studied Thomas for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing. Then he gave the slightest nod and returned to his work. It was agreement enough. The two men had spent years building trust through careful observation of each other's character. Isaac knew that Thomas wouldn't propose something reckless or impulsive. Thomas knew that Isaac's hatred of the Blackwoods ran deep enough to risk everything if genuine opportunity for revenge presented itself. The days before William and Gregory's departure passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas maintained his usual routines with even more precision than normal, feeding the foxhounds at exact times, cleaning the kennels with meticulous attention, preparing equipment for the hunting season that would begin after the Blackwoods returned. He gave no indication that anything unusual was being contemplated, no sign that he was counting down to a moment of irreversible action. On the morning of October 15th, William and Gregory departed from the Blackwood Estate in a sturdy carriage loaded with tobacco samples and business documents. They planned to take the main road east toward Augusta before turning south toward Savannah, a journey that would require 3 days of travel with overnight stops at inns along the route. Marcus Pemberton stood on the porch of the main house and watched them depart, already anticipating the relative freedom their absence would provide. Thomas watched from the kennel yards, noting the exact time of their departure and the direction they traveled. The foxhounds seemed to sense his tension, moving restlessly in their enclosures, whining softly as if they understood something significant was approaching. Thomas fed them their morning meal, adding slightly larger portions than usual. He wanted them satisfied and calm for what was coming, not agitated by hunger. Thomas waited until nightfall before approaching Isaac at the edge of the tobacco fields. The older man had just finished his day's work, his hands still stained dark from handling the cured leaves in the drying barn. They met in the shadows between 2 storage sheds, a location Thomas had selected weeks earlier because it offered clear sight lines in all directions while remaining outside the normal patrol routes Marcus Pemberton followed during his evening rounds. The plan Thomas outlined was simple in concept but would require absolute precision in execution. William and Gregory had taken the main road east, a route that wound through 15 miles of dense Georgia forest before reaching the first town of any significance. About 6 miles from the plantation, the road passed through a particularly isolated stretch where ancient oaks formed a canopy so thick that even midday sun barely penetrated to the forest floor. This section of road dipped into a small valley where a creek crossed the path, requiring travelers to ford through shallow water before climbing the opposite bank. Thomas had walked this route a dozen times over the past year, always finding legitimate reasons for his presence. He'd claimed to be tracking a wounded deer that the foxhounds had pursued during a hunt. He'd mentioned to William that he wanted to scout new territory for future expeditions. Each trip had allowed him to study the terrain with the eye of someone planning an ambush rather than simply passing through. The creek crossing was perfect for their purposes. The banks on either side rose steeply enough that a carriage would need to slow considerably to navigate the descent and subsequent climb. The thick forest provided cover within 20 feet of the road itself. Most importantly, this location was far enough from any plantation or settlement that screams would go unheard, yet close enough that 2 men on foot could reach it and return within a single night. Isaac listened without interruption as Thomas explained what needed to happen. They would depart the plantation separately 2 hours before dawn, meeting at a predetermined point in the forest. They would carry with them the tools necessary for what Thomas had planned, items he'd been gathering and hiding over the past months. They would reach the ambush site well before William and Gregory were expected to pass through on their return journey. Then they would wait. The killing itself would need to be swift and certain. Thomas had no illusions about his capacity for violence. He'd never struck another person in his life, had spent 18 years learning to absorb abuse rather than return it. But he'd slaughtered pigs and chickens for the plantation's kitchen. He'd field-dressed deer after successful hunts. He understood anatomy well enough to know where major blood vessels ran close to the surface, where a blade needed to penetrate to reach vital organs, how much force was required to sever the connections between life and death. What came after the killing would be more complex. Bodies couldn't simply be left in the forest because they'd be discovered too quickly. Burying them would take too long and leave obvious signs of disturbed earth. The Etowah River was too far away to make drowning a practical option. Thomas had considered every conventional method of concealing murder victims and rejected them all as inadequate. His solution was brutal in its simplicity. The foxhounds had been trained to consume meat of all varieties. They'd eaten venison, rabbit, squirrel, and occasionally livestock that had died from disease or accident. Their digestive systems were efficient enough to break down flesh and bone alike, leaving minimal waste. 8 dogs, fed carefully over several days, could eliminate 2 adult human bodies with thoroughness if the bodies were first reduced to portions the animals could manage. Isaac's face remained expressionless as Thomas explained this final element of the plan. For a long moment, the older man said nothing, simply standing in the darkness while processing what he'd heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked Thomas if he understood there would be no turning back from this, that once they crossed this line, they would be forever changed regardless of whether they were caught. He asked if Thomas had truly considered what it meant to do what he was proposing. Thomas met Isaac's eyes directly and answered with complete honesty. He said he'd already been changed by everything the Blackwoods had done to him and his family. He said he'd already crossed lines he never imagined crossing simply by surviving in a system designed to destroy human dignity. He said that feeding dogs human flesh was monstrous, but no more monstrous than using those same dogs to hunt human beings like animals. He said he was already damned by virtue of being born into bondage, and that he'd rather be damned for choosing his own actions than for passively accepting what had been done to him. Isaac nodded slowly and extended his hand. The 2 men shook, sealing an agreement that would bind them together in conspiracy and consequence. They separated immediately afterward, returning to their respective cabins through different routes, both understanding that from this moment forward, every interaction would need to appear completely normal to avoid generating suspicion. The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened awareness that made every sound seem amplified and every shadow potentially threatening. Thomas maintained his routines with the foxhounds, but he also began subtly altering their feeding schedule. He reduced their portions slightly, not enough to make them visibly hungry or change their behavior, but sufficient to ensure they'd be eager to eat when the time came. He also began adding small amounts of unfamiliar proteins to their regular meals, conditioning them to accept variety in their diet without hesitation. He gathered the tools he would need with careful deliberation. A woodsman's axe from the plantation's equipment shed, its edge honed to razor sharpness. 2 butcher knives from the kitchen, borrowed during times when the cook was occupied elsewhere. Rope that he'd accumulated in short lengths over months, each piece taken from different locations to avoid creating obvious patterns of theft. A canvas tarp that had been used to cover tobacco during transport and was now stored in one of the barns. Each item was hidden in a different location along the route he and Isaac would take to the ambush site. Thomas had learned from watching Marcus Pemberton conduct searches of the slave quarters that the overseer looked for concentrations of suspicious items rather than individual pieces. A single knife hidden beneath floorboards might escape notice. An axe stored with other tools wouldn't generate questions. By distributing his arsenal across multiple hiding spots, Thomas minimized the risk of discovery while ensuring he'd have everything he needed when the moment arrived. On the evening of October 20th, 5 days after William and Gregory's departure, a rider arrived at the plantation with a message from Marcus Pemberton. The Blackwoods would be returning the following day, having concluded their business in Savannah more quickly than anticipated. They expected to reach the plantation by late afternoon, assuming weather and road conditions remained favorable. Thomas received this news from one of the house servants who'd overheard the conversation between Pemberton and the messenger. The accelerated timeline meant he and Isaac would need to move that very night rather than waiting another day as originally planned. It also meant they'd have less time at the ambush site and would need to execute their plan with even greater efficiency than Thomas had anticipated. He found Isaac in the tobacco barn just after sunset, ostensibly checking on curing racks but actually waiting for Thomas to make contact. A brief exchange of glances communicated everything necessary. They would proceed as planned but on compressed timeline. 2 hours before dawn, they would begin. Thomas returned to his cabin and lay on his pallet, knowing sleep would be impossible but needing to at least rest his body for what was coming. His mind raced through the plan repeatedly, examining each step for potential failures, considering contingencies for various scenarios. He thought about his mother and brother, about the years of accumulated injustice that had led to this moment. He thought about the foxhounds and the irony of using the Blackwood's own instruments of terror against them. He thought about what it would feel like to kill another human being, even humans he hated with every fiber of his existence. When the time came, Thomas rose from his pallet and moved through the darkness with practiced silence. He'd spent years learning to navigate the plantation at night, understanding which paths avoided the areas where Pemberton might be conducting his irregular patrols. He reached the first cache of hidden supplies and retrieved the rope and tarp, shouldering them like a pack before moving deeper into the forest. Isaac materialized from the shadows at their designated meeting point, carrying the axe and knives wrapped in cloth to prevent any metallic sounds that might carry through the still night air. The two men exchanged no words, simply falling into step beside each other as they moved through the forest toward the creek crossing 6 miles distant. The journey took nearly 2 hours, conducted entirely in darkness beneath a canopy that blocked even the pale light of the waning moon. Both men knew the route well enough to navigate by feel and memory, their feet finding purchase on familiar terrain despite the absence of visibility. They moved with the efficiency of people whose survival had always depended on the ability to be invisible and silent. They reached the ambush site well before dawn, giving themselves time to prepare and position everything for maximum effectiveness. Thomas had selected 2 large oak trees on opposite sides of the road, about 30 feet apart. From these positions, he and Isaac would have clear views of the creek crossing and the approaches on both sides. The plan was for Isaac to create an obstacle in the road that would force William and Gregory to stop their carriage, at which point both men would emerge simultaneously from concealment. The obstacle Thomas had devised was ingeniously simple. He'd spent weeks loosening a large dead tree that stood near the road, sawing through its base in a way that left it standing but barely attached to its stump. Now, with Isaac's help, he pushed the tree over so that it fell directly across the road at the creek crossing. The crash echoed through the forest, loud enough to startle birds from their roosts, but this far from any habitation, the sound would raise no alarm. With the trap set, there was nothing to do but wait. Thomas and Isaac took their positions behind the oak trees, the weapons they'd brought distributed between them. The tarp was hidden nearby, ready to be used for transporting what would remain after they'd finished. As the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. The waiting was nearly over. Soon, one way or another, everything would change. The Blackwood's carriage appeared on the road shortly after full daylight, the sound of horses' hooves and creaking wheels announcing their approach several minutes before they came into view. Thomas could hear William's voice, gruff and confident, discussing something about tobacco prices with his son. The ordinary quality of their conversation, the complete absence of any awareness of danger, filled Thomas with a kind of grim satisfaction. For once, the Blackwoods would experience what it felt like to have violence come from nowhere, to have their sense of security shattered in an instant. When the carriage reached the fallen tree, William cursed loudly and called for Gregory to help him clear the obstacle. Both men climbed down from the carriage, approaching the tree to assess its size and determine the best method for moving it aside. They were focused entirely on the problem before them, their backs turned to the forest, when Thomas and Isaac emerged from concealment and struck. The violence was over in moments, brutal and efficient in a way that surprised even Thomas. Isaac moved with a speed that belied his size, bringing the axe handle down across the back of William's skull before the older man could turn fully around. The impact made a sound like a branch breaking, and William dropped to his knees, stunned but not yet unconscious. Gregory had better reflexes, spinning toward the sound of his father's collapse, but Thomas was already there with one of the butcher knives. Thomas had never struck another person with intent to harm, but 18 years of suppressed rage found expression in that first thrust. The blade entered Gregory's side just below the ribs, angled upward the way Thomas had learned from butchering hogs. Gregory's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his mouth opening to scream, but Isaac was there instantly with a length of rope, looping it around the younger man's throat and pulling tight enough to reduce the scream to a strangled gurgle. William was attempting to rise, blood running down the back of his head where Isaac's blow had split the skin. Thomas kicked him hard in the ribs, feeling bones crack beneath his foot, feeling a savage satisfaction at the sound of William's pain grunt. The plantation owner sprawled forward onto the muddy ground near the creek, his hands scrabbling uselessly as he tried to orient himself and understand what was happening. The two enslaved men worked with grim efficiency born of necessity rather than experience. They bound William and Gregory with the rope Thomas had brought, tying their hands behind their backs and their ankles together. They gagged both men with strips torn from their own clothing, ensuring that any sounds they made would be muffled beyond recognition. Then they dragged their captives off the road and deeper into the forest, away from any possibility of discovery by passing travelers. In a small clearing about 50 yards from the road, Thomas finally allowed himself to look directly at the two men who had destroyed his family. William's face was purple with rage and pain, his eyes blazing with an emotion that might have been disbelief that enslaved people would dare to attack him. Gregory looked different, younger somehow, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching terror as blood continued to seep from the wound in his side. Thomas knelt beside William and spoke for the first time since the ambush began. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, as he explained exactly why this was happening. He talked about Daniel being whipped until his back was destroyed, then sold away like livestock. He described Ruth's slow death from grief, the way she'd simply stopped wanting to live after losing her youngest son. He detailed every humiliation, every casual cruelty, every moment of suffering that the Blackwoods had inflicted not just on his family but on every enslaved person who'd ever had the misfortune of being their property. William's eyes showed no comprehension, no understanding that anything Thomas was saying justified what was being done to him. Even now, even in this moment of complete powerlessness, the plantation owner couldn't conceive of enslaved people as fully human. His rage wasn't the rage of someone who understood he'd committed wrongs and was now facing consequences. It was the rage of a man who believed his property had malfunctioned, that the natural order of things had somehow been violated. Gregory was different. As Thomas spoke and as the younger Blackwood's lifeblood continued to drain into the Georgia soil, something shifted in his expression. Perhaps it was simply the proximity of death that made him more receptive to truth. Perhaps it was the realization that his father's philosophy had created the very situation that would now end both their lives. Whatever the reason, Gregory's eyes showed something that might have been the beginning of understanding before pain and blood loss carried him beyond the capacity for thought. The killing took longer than Thomas had anticipated. He'd imagined it would be quick, a few decisive actions and it would be finished. But the reality of ending human life, even lives he hated, proved more complicated. His hands shook as he worked. His stomach threatened to rebel several times. Isaac had to take over when Thomas found himself unable to continue, the older man's face grim but determined as he did what necessity demanded. When it was finally over, when both Blackwoods lay still in the clearing with their blood darkening the earth beneath them, Thomas and Isaac sat in silence for several minutes. The enormity of what they'd done settled over them like a physical weight. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd become killers, murderers by any definition, even if their victims had been murderers themselves in all but legal terminology. The practical work that followed was worse than the killing itself. Thomas had butchered animals countless times, but this was different in ways that made his mind recoil even as his hands continued working. He and Isaac used the knives and axe to reduce the bodies to portions that could be transported, working with mechanical efficiency while trying not to think too deeply about what they were doing. The tarp became essential, providing a surface they could work on and a means of carrying the results. They made multiple trips between the clearing and a location Thomas had selected weeks earlier, a rocky outcropping about a mile from the plantation where he could hide what they'd done until the next phase of his plan could be implemented. Each journey through the forest felt surreal, as if Thomas was watching himself from outside his own body, observing actions that seemed impossible even as he performed them. The carriage and horses presented a separate problem. They couldn't simply abandon them near the ambush site because that would immediately indicate foul play and focus the investigation on that specific location. Thomas had considered this complication during his planning and developed a solution that was risky but necessary. He and Isaac drove the carriage several miles further down the road before steering it off into a ravine where thick undergrowth would conceal it from casual observation. They released the horses, knowing the animals would eventually find their way to a farm or plantation where they'd be taken in as strays. By the time Thomas and Isaac made their way back to the Blackwood Estate, dawn was breaking over the tobacco fields. Both men were exhausted, covered in dirt and blood that they'd need to wash away before anyone saw them. They separated at the edge of the forest, Isaac heading to the creek that ran past the slave quarters while Thomas made for the well near the kennels. The foxhounds began baying as soon as they sensed Thomas's approach, their keen noses detecting something different about him even though he'd washed away the obvious evidence. He fed them their normal morning meal, then returned to his cabin to change into clean clothes and hide the garments he'd worn during the night. Everything that couldn't be cleaned would need to be burned, another task that would require careful execution to avoid generating suspicion. The day passed in a strange fog of normalcy punctuated by moments of sharp clarity when the reality of what he'd done would crash over Thomas like a wave. He performed his usual duties with the foxhounds, cleaned the kennels, prepared equipment for the upcoming hunting season. He interacted with other enslaved people as he always did, showing no sign of the fundamental change that had occurred inside him during the previous night. Marcus Pemberton noticed nothing unusual. The overseer went about his own routines, periodically checking on various work details but spending most of his time in his cabin with a bottle of whiskey, taking advantage of the Blackwood's absence to indulge in the kind of drinking he couldn't do when his employers were present. His lack of vigilance was exactly what Thomas had counted on when planning the timing of his actions. As afternoon stretched toward evening with no sign of William and Gregory's return, Thomas began the most delicate phase of his plan. He approached Pemberton's cabin with an expression of appropriate concern and mentioned that the Blackwoods had been expected back by now. The overseer, already half drunk, waved off the concern and said they'd probably stopped for the night at an inn rather than pushing to reach the plantation after dark. It was a plausible explanation that bought Thomas the time he needed. That night, under cover of darkness, Thomas began feeding the foxhounds their special supplemental meals. He'd carefully prepared portions small enough that the dogs wouldn't gorge themselves sick but substantial enough to ensure that over the next several days, all evidence of the Blackwoods would be eliminated. The animals ate eagerly, their breeding and training having long ago eliminated any squeamishness about their food sources. 3 days passed before Marcus Pemberton's concern transformed into genuine alarm. When a full week elapsed with no word from the Blackwoods, he rode toward Dalton to send telegrams. The responses disturbed him. The tobacco brokers confirmed no meeting had occurred. The inn reported the men never checked in. Pemberton organized search parties. Thomas volunteered the foxhounds, maintaining his facade of concern. The search yielded only fragments. The abandoned carriage appeared in a ravine, damaged but revealing nothing. Personal items scattered along the road suggested ambush but proved nothing definitive. Sheriff Crawford interviewed every enslaved person but encountered absolute silence. The community protected Thomas and Isaac, understanding that whatever happened represented justice the legal system would never provide. Crawford eventually concluded bandits had killed the Blackwoods, their bodies lost to the wilderness. Catherine Blackwood inherited the estate and shocked everyone by freeing all enslaved people within 3 months. She sold the land and departed Georgia permanently. Thomas and Isaac accepted freedom and fled separately, never speaking of that October night again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.